Hey guys, this is the TV Siblings podcast. We are one sibling short today. Sid is away on a business trip in Taipei, so we are the sisters holding the ground this week. This is Harini.
And this is Waitha.
And we are reviewing Mr. Robot, Season 4, Episode 7, titled
Proxy Authentication Required.
All right. So what did we think of this episode?
Honestly, after watching the episode for the first time, I was pretty depressed.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people felt this way. It felt like a friend or someone we know was going through something really, really horrible and awful. And I think credit to the show for making us feel those emotions.
Absolutely.
But that's honestly what I felt initially. But then in having time to process it and think about the episode, it completely recontextualizes so many different aspects of the show, and I can't wait to talk about it more in depth later on because it clarifies so many different aspects of the show that were confusing to me before, and a really, really interesting take for the show to go.
Absolutely. I completely am on the same wavelength as you, Sweet, that I'm sure many people are as well. I felt so broken after watching that episode. Exactly what you said, Sweet, that if I felt like this was happening to someone I know personally, and exactly credit to the writers, the actors. Rami killed it in this episode. Just fantastic acting on his part, as well as Krista, Vera, everybody involved. And I have to say, this is probably the best episode of TV I've ever watched, hands down. Everything about it was just immaculate and just genius. The ambiance, the way they did the music, the way they made it into parts like act 1 and to like a play format, and it's incredible because it was literally just the entire episode was just in one apartment in 2 rooms. That's it, and it was fantastic. Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about it.
So jumping right in, the episode is structured like a play with 4 acts. And the episode starts off with Vera talking about his time in the Dominican and how he slowly rose to power there and ran everything there. Then he got bored and felt empty. He met a shaman who had him drink something random and told him, "It's time for you to go home." And he realized he wanted to go home to New York and own everything and everyone there selling drugs and essentially, become like a drug lord in New York, king of New York. Any thoughts on the first act before I jump into Act 2?
No, you can go right along. Vera's just an incredible storyteller per usual.
I don't know. I think he was kind of dragging on.
He was dragging.
Like I was a little bit on like Mr. Robot's side, where I was like, all right, come on, like let's get to the point. But yeah, an interesting journey that Vera's been on.
I will say just one point. The music choice is very interesting during this entire Act 1. It was very heroic, kind of building Vera up in his story when it really was just like, what are you trying to say? Like, this is not of as much import, according to Mr. Robot and Elliot's expression. So I thought that was a funny touch.
Yeah, definitely. The next act is where we start to really get into the meat of the episode, where Vera interacts with Mr. Robot, and he is basically pressing on him and saying, how did you start? How did you come to be? And Mr. Robot answers, he needed me. And Vera pushes on him and says, why? If you're here to protect him, he must have gotten hurt real bad. Mm-hmm. And it's starting to dive into the origins of Mr. Robot and why he was created, what Elliot went through. And Mr. Robot and Elliot bargain with Vera saying, you have to let us go so that we can give you the money from the Deus group in order for you to ultimately achieve your dreams. So Mr. Robot and Elliot kind of deviate away from what Vera's really trying to dig into and divert their attention more to the plan and the money and that type of thing. Act 3, poor Elliot. This is where he, kind of shows Vera the plan and how much money he can hope to get from the Deus group. And he reaches into his backpack and tries to shoot Vera, but sadly with a gun with no bullets. And that's where things start to really get heated, and Vera threatens Krista, and it basically has a gun to her head, and Elliot is like scrambling for excuses. You know, she's a good person. Don't do this. And Vera's like, not good enough, not good enough. And Elliot finally just admits that he really needs her.
Right.
And then the episode kind of quickly transitions into a forced therapy session. And that brings us to Act 4, where Vera starts reading Krista's notes, and things are really getting heated, and Vera brings up the window incident. And Krista starts pleading with Vera, like, please, like, this is not how something like this is supposed to go. She really wanted Elliot to come to this realization on his own and not be forced into it, like this really tense and forced situation is happening. Elliot starts to get curious, and he's like, no, I really need to know, like, what's going on? Like, you know, stop hiding it, stop beating around the bush, like, I really need to know. And so she starts to ask him, like, why do you think you don't remember that memory all that clearly? And Krista's slowly guiding him towards the truth, slowly starting to peel away the layers of Elliot's memory of the window incident. And before I say any more, how long do you think Krista's known about what actually happened?
So that was a point of confusion for me. So did Krista know already that he was being molested, or did she just know that he had a secret and that needed to come out?
I think that she knew.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with her psychiatrist background, she put 2 and 2 together that this was a repressed memory for Elliot and something, and that's why she frames it that way, where she says, why do you think you don't remember exactly what happened?
Got it.
It's not like she's realizing in the moment. She's asking him, like, you know, questions very, very carefully up until the final moment where she asks him, were you molested?
Right.
And so I think she's known, and I think she wanted to take her time slowly guiding Elliot towards this revelation rather than this really forced situation. It's not clear to me exactly how long she's known. It might be in some of the later sessions that she started to piece things together. And Elliot, you know, gave a very different interpretation of the window incident. And so
Absolutely, yeah.
Krista really had to, like I said, like draw inferences from what he's told her and his trauma and his dissociative identity disorder to figure out that something really bad happened with his dad. And I think that window incident, I think she realized that that's what led to that.
So in that case, she probably found out as soon as Elliot, in that one therapy session, I can't remember which season it was, probably season 3, where he says, oh yeah, like that was the day, it was like around my birthday, and like we built a snowman and my dad pushed me out the window. And she was like, what? Like, I didn't know that.
Yeah, maybe.
She might have had like inklings. And so I didn't really know this, but I guess for dissociative identity disorder, one of the main causes or catalysts of it is physical abuse as a child. So there might have been a chance, or actually a very good chance, that Krista already had an inkling that that's where it was coming from, but didn't have like the grounds or the means to really confirm that until she heard of this window incident.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, in my mind, Elliot has these different personalities and kind of a fractured mind in a way that happened from childhood trauma, but I thought that he already had enough pain in his life to create all of that, right? Like, he had to deal with his mother's physical abuse and her emotional abuse in a way, and also the death of his father and feeling really alone. And I thought that that was enough to create the dissociative identity disorder and fracture his personality in this way. But then we find out the awful truth that there's so much more.
I know.
Yeah, but to jump back into it, you know, Elliot is starting to realize what happened, and Krista asks him, you know, why do you think you were swinging a bat around? Do you think you might have been afraid of something? Do you think you might have been afraid of your father? And Elliot starts to realize what happened, and he's confused because he doesn't quite remember, and he is asking, you know, well, why would I be afraid of my father? He was my friend.
Right.
And it's so crushing, so crushing to watch this. And this is when Mr. Robot says, I can't protect you anymore.
And he walks off screen.
I think you off screen, Harney, made the note that feels like a goodbye when he says that.
I hope not. I don't think so, actually. And we'll talk about this after the recap, but I feel like there's more to face.
I agree. I think they're definitely going to meet each other again, but I do think in some ways this is the end of their relationship as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Robot is no longer going to be a confidant for Elliot. He's no longer going to be a helper, a friend. That chapter is completely done.
Correct.
And so then Krista asks him, did he ask you to do something you didn't want to do? And that's when Elliot remembers, his father sexually abused him as a child. And then this leads to Act 5, where Vera surprisingly really tries to help Elliot and shares his own story about sexual abuse and tells him that he can turn his pain into power. And I love this line. I think it's really powerful, where he says, once you've weathered the storm, you become the storm.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he's a little bit of a hypocrite because he raped and beat Shayla.
Exactly.
And so he's not really, someone who respects other people's identity, especially their personal boundaries and things like that. But it is really interesting that he does care about Elliot, and he tries to help him in this moment. And that's when Krista out of nowhere stabs him in the back.
So great. And
the lights go off one by one.
That was such a wild ride. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, where to start? There's a few things just across the course of the episode I just wanted to say. So for the acts, we were talking about this earlier off screen because we just couldn't wait to talk about it together. But I do feel like the acts were supposed to be the different stages of grief through Elliot's perspective. Just have to look it up real quick. But stages of denial, anger with Mr. Robot coming in, taking over, talking to Vera. A third act of bargaining for Krista's life. Depression when he kind of finds out about the molestation, that the truth about Mr. Robot, why he was even there for him. And finally, acceptance with Vera, kind of talking him through this whole situation and how he can rise up out of it. I thought that was, I don't know if that's the case, but it does seem that way. And if it is that way, it's very beautifully done. Everything was very precise and carefully crafted. Very well done.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Elliot, now that he has had this realization and it's in the forefront of his consciousness, he's going to go through these stages again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually really interesting with the 5 stages of grief. When that theory first came out, it got a lot of criticism because a lot of people said, well, that's not how I experience grief. And the psychologist who put out that theory, she said that it's not a linear process for everyone that goes through it. And not everyone goes through every stage of grief in that same way. Mm-hmm. But it's a good model to show the different stages of grief and how a lot of people can experience grief. And so I think that Elliot, unfortunately, is going to have to go through this a few more times. And I think we're going through it in a certain way because,
definitely,
like we were talking about, it recontextualizes everything where now we see Mr. Robot totally differently.
I know.
And I think it explains so much for me, where I've always really struggled with the complex nature of Mr. Robot's character. He's at some times so threatening and so menacing and so in your face. Mm-hmm. And it's just very, very uncomfortable at moments. And then other times he's incredibly protective and clearly cares so much about Elliot. And I mean, it just goes to show what a complicated relationship that Elliot had with his father, Edward Alderson. And I don't know, it makes you feel sick when you think about those moments where Edward Alderson is being really sweet to Elliot because there's something really dark and twisted about it now.
Exactly. It definitely taints everything. And it sucks because Mr. Robot's such a huge character of the show alongside Elliot that we've come to know and care for as well. So this completely taints his entire character. I did want to actually talk about some of the recap prior to this episode.
Absolutely,
there's
me too.
A lot of key scenes that I think were important leading into this.
Definitely.
So I think the first thing was just the picture of Elliot and his dad at Christmas. This was something that I picked up, and I don't know if there's a reasonable explanation for this, Sweta, but there seems to be always a different child actor for the young Elliot character. The one in the picture is the one that I'm most used to, but then there's another scene in the recap where it's young Elliot and his dad at the movie theater, and it's a completely different child actor. And I don't think that I can't argue that he's an older age or something like that. He looks completely different to the other child actor. And this is the more aggressive, more melancholy child. But in this scene, which has a completely different color and shade to it now, Elliot tells his dad, he's like, "You're sick and you just don't want to admit it." That has a totally different meaning to me now. Like, I don't think, and we'll get into this maybe a little bit more, or even now, about his dad having cancer. Sveith and I, we were talking about this. I initially felt like maybe his dad never even had cancer, and that was just a way for Elliot's mind to protect himself from the real issue at hand. But I do feel like Sweta was discussing or telling off screen, he probably did have cancer just like Angela's mom had cancer, but that might have still been just a cover-up in Elliot's mind to contextualize and rationalize everything that had happened to him. And the secret that Elliot had told his mom was not so much that Elliot's dad had cancer, but that he was sexually abusing him. Because I always felt that was a little bit off, like even just from the previous seasons, whenever Elliot would talk about it, particularly in the scene where Mr. Robot and Elliot are on the pier in Coney Island, and Mr. Robot pushes him off the pier. Elliot talks about that day. He's like, yeah, he was really pissed off that I told mom about the fact that he had cancer, and then he pushed me out the window. I was like, that's a complete overreaction to something like that. Like, that never sat right with me. But now with this new information, it completely makes sense.
Definitely. And I actually wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that scene that you're talking about at the movie theater. It's the flashback scene from the episode Don't Delete Me. And I remember when we first watched the scene, little kid Elliot seems really fucked up. You're like, why is he being such a jerk? You know, his dad just wants to spend time with him. And it, like you said, it totally has a different meaning now, where little Elliot says, you know, I don't want to be here, I want to go home. And Edward Alderson says, how long are you going to be mad at me? I told you I was sorry. And the little kid says, you're not sorry. You're just sick and you don't want to admit it.
Oh my gosh.
And then Edward says, I wish I could have been a better father to you. And all I'm asking is that you forgive me. Do you think you'll ever be able to do that? And the kid says, no. Yeah. And it's just heartbreaking because we think, you know, is it the tension between Edward asking him to keep the secret of the cancer, this and that? But it's not that at all. It's much darker than that. And I absolutely think you're right. I think this was the secret that Edward asked little Elliot to keep, the secret of the sexual abuse. And like we talked about, I do think Edward Alderson had cancer. I think that he was coughing. He died, you know, suddenly at a young age. Angela's mom similarly had a similar illness. They were both, you know, this is what the whole Washington Township scandal was about. I don't think all of that is, you know, in Elliot's mind. I do think that happened, but I definitely think you're right where this is the secret that he was holding, and he might have told Magda. Yeah. We do know that Magda has not a very good impression of Edward Alderson. She calls him weak and pathetic in certain scenes. And so I think she probably knew, as awful as that feels. Yeah. And one question that I had for you is, how much does Darlene know about all of this?
Exactly. That was my next question to you as well. But right before we talk about that, I think it's a little naive for us to think as viewers, and I'm definitely in that pot where we were naively thinking, oh, like Elliot has had, if you have two parents and his mom was a shitty parent, then he must have had at least one good parent, which was his dad, and we were just rationalizing that. Like, his dad was always, of course he's good. Like, we never thought, or maybe we thought in some, you know, context that both his parents might be bad. Yeah. That never came across my mind, you know. There's definitely some instances or scenes or things that Elliot has said over the past 4 years in these series that probably didn't make sense, even down to the episode where Elliot's mom died, and we were talking about the nurse who, you know, really raved about and praised his mom, and like, some things are just not adding up about his parents in general. But it never occurred to me that it could be the fact that his life was just a shitty childhood. You know, it was shitty all around. Both his parents were not good to him. But yeah, so getting to Darlene, this is something I kind of grappled with for a little bit because Sid is not here, but he did give us some of his thoughts. He had a theory or a thought that potentially Edward Alderson molested all 3 kids, so Elliot, Darlene, and potentially even Angela. Once thinking about it a little more, I don't think that Darlene was ever sexually abused by Edward Alderson nor Angela. I think it was just towards Elliot, and that there's a few things that speak to that. I mean, Elliot told Darlene to go in the closet to hide, presumably to protect her from seeing what's going to occur. Probably so much to the fact that he threw himself out the window as the only means to escape his dad. And Darlene would probably be a lot younger at that time, probably doesn't remember even if anything happened. And this is to Sid's credit. He mentioned when we were texting, there was an episode and a scene with Darlene where they're reminiscing about their dad, and she says, I wish I knew him better enough to remember him. So I think there's a little context clues to tell me that she probably was not. What do you think, Swetha?
Yeah, that's, I agree with that 100%, where I think Darlene probably did not know about this abuse, and Elliot very intentionally hides her in the closet. And she was really young at the time, and so she might not have even understood what was going on fully. And I agree with you that Darlene, who for the most part, we feel like we can trust her memory and her recollections. They're not all altered like Elliot's memories are. And I do believe that she's a reliable narrator, understanding that she was a kid at the time. Mm-hmm. She does think fondly of Edward Alderson.
Oh, yeah.
And so I definitely don't think she knew about all of this. But here's the thing where we always talk about Magda, and do we actually think she's a bad person or not? Mm-hmm. The one piece of insight that we get into Magda is that story that Darlene tells Cisco about running away from home and being with that lady, where if she thinks, you know, Edward Alderson was a good father and kind, she was not wanting to go home because Magda was not a good mother.
Correct.
And so I think, yeah, unfortunately, just an awful, awful, awful childhood for Elliot.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Darlene. Yeah. I mean, Darlene lost her father quite early and grew up in a very, sounds like, toxic childhood with an abusive mother. And I just feel so bad for both of them.
Yeah, just rough reveal. But I have to say, this was wildly subtle about his dad molesting him this whole time, but as soon as they revealed that, a lot of things clicked into place. First being, I actually liked how they placed this in the scene. Right after Elliot finds out, Vera goes to like touch him, and Elliot says, "Don't touch me," and instantly it clicked. Like definitely. Of course, that's why. And I specifically think it's towards men that he doesn't like touching him. We see with Ollie, we see with even Gideon at some point, but he has no problems like hugging Angela or touching Darlene or holding Darlene. Like, I think it's just there's something that's triggering with him and men touching him, which completely makes sense in this context. I also think
to some degree the touching is he's only okay with people touching him that he really, really trusts.
Yeah.
And that's why, actually, the only people we see him okay with touching him are Angela and Darlene. There's actually no one else that he interacts with that he feels comfortable with that.
Correct.
And absolutely, it's just, you're absolutely right. That makes so much more sense. And as I mentioned, you know, the conflict with Mr. Robot's whole, like, persona, why is he so schizophrenic in a certain way? And it makes perfect sense. It's like, of course, like there are two wildly different personalities that Elliot contextualizes his father in.
Right.
The one side that's so, so caring, and the other side that just made him feel so terrified and so violated and not protected at all.
Absolutely.
Mr. Robot in some ways is what Elliot's father should have been.
Exactly.
Protecting him instead of abusing him, instead of taking advantage of him, especially as a child. And, you know, that's where I think it's really interesting when Vera's, you know, talking to Mr. Robot, and he says, like, why are you here? Like, what are you even here for?
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm here to protect him. Mm-hmm. And then when the truth comes out about this abuse, that's when he fades into the background and says, I can't protect you anymore.
Right. And like what you were saying, Sweet, that in the beginning about the stages of grief, that Elliot's going to have to go through this many times. I feel like Elliot has already gone through this before. I think this is something, I think he's been in kind of like a loop where this has happened before, where he remembers once again that his dad used to molest him, and he kind of does like a reboot and reset, and he's back to not remembering, and then it's like kind of this vicious cycle. Whether or not that's true, if that's even happened before, is up to debate, but I feel like it has happened at least once before. And that's
definitely. I actually don't think it actually happened in the window incident. I think that his dad like tried to make it happen, and that's when he literally grabs the bat and starts to defend himself because he doesn't want it to happen. So I think his dad only asks in that moment. I definitely think it's happened at least 2, 3, if not like 10 times in the past.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting. I thought the scene where his dad had come up was following after the fact that Ellie had told his mom, and his dad was angry about it and came up to confront him or something. But I don't know if that all happened on the same day now, but I'm not sure.
You're right that's what I had thought about it too, but it's not the way that Krista frames it.
Okay.
Because Krista clearly says, did your father ask you to do something that you didn't want to do? Mm-hmm. And there's only really one thing that could mean.
Gotcha. Yeah, you're right. And just to put everything into context once more, we kind of touched on this outside of the podcast, but it makes sense, like even subconsciously, Elliot in his hacks, like the very first hack we see in Ron's coffee shop, he's been kind of targeting mostly men actually who have been into pedophilia or child pornography with Ron's coffee shop, and most recently in this episode, or this season rather, with Freddie Lomax. So this is something that's always been in the back of his mind, deep-rooted for obvious reasons, and now he's just kind of realizing it all over again, unfortunately.
I know, that's what's so interesting about it. I think that this is the big secret that Sam Esmail has said, you know, I'm surprised no one's come up with this theory before. And you're right, there are clues all over the place. I just think it's interesting, like no one's mind wanted to go that dark.
Exactly.
I think everyone thought that Elliot's already been through enough. Like, are you kidding me? Like, this is what happened, and these are, you know, the pieces of the puzzle that was missing. I think that's what's so shocking about all of it.
I just had a question for you. So I did not know at all where they're heading with this until he said it, or Krista said, like, Elliot, were you molested? I had no idea where they're going with this. Maybe my mind didn't want to go there, but what did you originally think was happening? What did you think the reveal was when they were leading up to it?
I thought they were going to talk about the other one.
Me too. I was waiting for a third personality to come out, or maybe a third persona of Elliot to come through, but none of that happened.
I thought maybe Krista knew about, you know, that there were more than one personalities inside of Elliot, and that she was trying to slowly draw it out of him. I was not expecting this particular reveal. It came as a complete shock to me. And I went through so many emotions when I was watching Elliot go through it. I just could not believe it.
Yeah, and I had a similar thought process to my brother said. I for sure thought it had something to do with Darlene. And so I was on the edge of my seat. I was like, oh shit, no. I was thinking whatever it is for sure is going to break his soul. Like it's just going to break him completely. But I don't know what. And the only thing that could really just throw him off and, you know, be soul crushing for him is if it was something to do with Darlene, like the one person in this world that cares for him, or that he can even just like rely on. So I thought like maybe Darlene is like the third personality, or like Darlene pushed him and just kind of has been like riding him this whole time. I had no idea it was going to be this.
Yeah, definitely. I was floored. Like you said, it makes so much sense in retrospect, but I did not see it coming at all.
Which is kind of wild, right? Like, I had no idea. I had no clue at all. We were all looking for like just a few episodes ago. We were all talking about it. We're like, hey, did you guys see if there was space for a third person in the way that they're placing all the characters? Like completely off. We're completely off.
And so, yeah, I think that segues into one of your theories about who the other one is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I am thinking along the lines of two different theories. I'll give you the one that I don't think is as relevant. Maybe the third person is Edward Alderson, him at his actual dad, his actual persona, as part of Elliot, that he's repressed inside of him, that he has to face at some point. The other theory that I think is more likely to happen is the third persona is Elliot once he has this information of his dad and kind of facing that repression or that person inside of him and ultimately breaking this cycle, this loop of him rebooting and restarting himself to forget.
Yeah, definitely. I think both of those could work.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I was thinking about, that young Elliot that we see in the boardroom.
Yeah.
I think that was the Elliot before he was abused.
Interesting.
Just the innocent version of Elliot that didn't have to go through all of this pain and suffering and loneliness and anger, all of these different emotions.
So it's interesting you bring that up. This is something I want to go back to. I kind of talked about it earlier. The fact that there are various versions, various child actors of Elliot, and I don't really understand. This is kind of getting ahead. We'll talk about the promo for next episode in a bit, but just to skip ahead to the promo, there is an actor. Elliot sees a split-second version of, I guess, another persona as him as a child, but it's not the same child actor that we even see in the boardroom.
Correct. And I actually think, so there's the young Elliot that we see in season 1.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the Elliot and I think that's the Elliot that we're most familiar with.
Yeah.
Then there's the Elliot that we see in the movie theater scene. And I actually think the kid that we see in the boardroom is a third version of him.
Okay.
And so, yes, I think you're right. We've seen like multiple different kid actors for some reason.
And that's obviously very deliberate on Sam Esmail's part. I just like don't understand, like, are those people not real? Like, I personally think that the the child actor in the movie theater was the persona and not actually Elliot, or maybe even the other way around. It might have been actually the real Elliot, and that's him with the hoodie, like being very repressed, the one who has been abused, and just feeling very dark in that moment. And it's him saying shush to his persona. And the Elliot that we're seeing, that we know that, like you just said, the one that we typically have seen in season 1 is Mr. Robot, kind of protecting Elliot or being that front for him. Because it is very strange. I don't really know what to make of that. It's the same thing with Angela, seeing the young Angela interrogating her in that room. Like,
definitely. I think that was very deliberate. You're absolutely right. I think that was very deliberate. I think it's hard to be sure, but I do think these different child actors that are playing Elliot are playing different versions of him.
Mm-hmm.
And they're each kind of serving a purpose. And the Elliot that we see the most, that we're most familiar with, he does seem really happy. Yeah. So I don't know. I can't explain why that's a different Elliot than the Elliot that we see in the boardroom.
Well,
but it is strange.
So just to get his disorders correct. So he does not have schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. He just has dissociative identity disorder. Is that what we're concluding?
I think so. He definitely has severe depression, too, and social anxiety disorder, but I think you're right. I think it's dissociative identity disorder, severe depression, and social anxiety.
I'm not super familiar with dissociative identity disorder, so is that something that can only occur or only appears with a very traumatic situation, such as what Elliot went through?
I think it usually does. It is incredibly rare.
Okay.
The other term for it is multiple personality disorder.
Oh, I see. Okay. So, okay.
But yes, I think that's the belief that usually that fracturing of someone's personality or these new personalities developing happen in the setting of severe trauma, whether it's emotional or physical or sexual.
I completely agree with what you were saying then about the different versions of Elliot and even the version of Mr. Robot. I think they're all aspects of his repressed memories or memories that he wishes he had. The Elliot that we come to know, the young Elliot, I think what you're saying, Sweet, is right. It probably is the Elliot, a very carefree version of him before all the sexual abuse was happening. The Elliot that we see probably in the promo is right after all that was happening with that knowledge. And of course, Mr. Robot is a version of his dad that he always wished he had, but didn't.
And actually, jumping ahead to the promo, maybe Elliot spends time with this like younger version of himself, and it actually helps him to explore a little bit more. I'm very curious to see how the next episode goes and Elliot's healing through all of this. But maybe that helps him get a little bit closer to being ready to maybe meet this other one.
So, in that case, do you feel like the other one is someone completely outside of Elliot, or do you think he's going to have to face a figure of his dad?
I think the most compelling argument so far probably is that it's either a version of himself or Edward Alderson.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially with considering the boardroom scene. In that context, this is a question I've been kind of grappling with myself. Do you think that that's the end of Mr. Robot? Do you think we'll see him again?
Well, like I was saying, I think that their relationship and how we've seen them interact up until this point in the show, that's done. I don't think we're ever going to see that again.
Sucks. They're such a great dynamic duo.
But I do think that there's going to be a round table in that boardroom or kind of a similar environment where all of Elliot's personalities are there and they're all interacting. And I think that Mr. Robot is going to kind of help him with it and help him through the healing process of it. But I think, him being kind of like a sidekick and helping him defeat White Rose, I think that's done.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, we should talk about Elliot's whole, last year has been dedicated to bringing down E-Corp and getting revenge for his dad and Angela's mom. Correct. And I wonder how Elliot's going to feel about all of that when he's thinking about it, because his whole mission seems conflicted now.
Exactly, and I think we were talking about this too. As a viewer, me watching this, to me, White Rose's plan is very minuscule in terms of importance right now, compared to what has just happened in this most recent episode. And I'm sure Elliot feels the same way. He probably doesn't give a shit anymore about White Rose's plan or taking them down or whatnot. Or it could go the complete opposite way, where he's like, just wants to bury himself in the work that he does, which he typically tends to do anyways, and just wants to get away and not think about what has just happened. But this got me thinking quite a bit, actually, because Miss White Rose knows Elliot quite well. And yeah, sure, maybe White Rose hacked Elliot and probably knows him through his dad, but that's the way that they contextualize all of that situation, is that Elliot's dad was just a worker, like on very low in the totem pole compared to Zhang, who was very, very, very high up on the food chain. So they probably wouldn't have known each other that well, but White Rose does know Elliot pretty well. He knows his patterns, his behaviors. He knows him well enough to know that he's an angry person and he's motivated by that anger about his dad, and he knows just as much about Angela as well. Something tells me that there's more to this story in terms of how much White Rose was actually in contact with Elliot's dad and even Angela's mom. And maybe even had a hand to play in Elliot thinking that his dad was a good person and died from cancer due to E-Corp, and was kind of playing a long con almost on Elliot to get him to be angry towards this institution of E-Corp to help him with his plan down the road. That's a very far off crockpot theory, but there's something off about it. I just can't put my finger on it.
I personally think it's more of like a happy coincidence. That's how White Rose sees Elliot. More of like a interesting opportunity where, like his father was really useful to her project, Elliot and his passion happens to also be useful. But I actually don't think she groomed him to be this certain way. I think they just happened to cross paths and then she saw his value. But I agree with you that she has tapped into this darker part of Elliot, this rage and anger, and she might know a little bit more than we think about the sexual abuse and what's going on with Elliot on that deeper level. It's just possible. On a very superficial level, clearly Elliot and Mr. Robot were really pissed off at E-Corp and things like that. And this is where the show gets really philosophical in a way. You think about Elliot going after the top 1% of the 1%. And all of these large-scale government institutions and these big world players making all these decisions behind people's back. But if you think about what destroyed Elliot's life, it was a shitty father.
Right.
It was one person. It wasn't like, this whole conspiracy and all these people making all these crazy decisions.
Totally.
It was like so personal and so direct what happened to him. And it's like so interesting to think about, where we've been kind of racing towards this Deus group meeting, like all these things that are happening. And like you said, like it feels like meaningless now. It's like, why does that even matter anymore?
Totally.
So interesting.
And I think that makes everything even more relatable, I think we all have this grandiose idea to, kind of take down the people that are above us, who are not making the good decisions or corrupt in some way. But what really comes down to, what really matters to us at the end of the day are, the people around us, the people we're supposed to rely on, who love us. And there's no worse betrayal than having a loved one disappoint us or do something to hurt us. So I think that was very relatable, to have it kind of go in that route. For White Rose, the only thing I can't reason out is, in last episode, White Rose very distinctly says, it's time he knows we're on the same side. What does he even mean by that? There's
Definitely.
clearly something.
How much does he know?
Exactly. We know why White Rose wants to kind of, whatever the thing is. I think we all have come to a conclusion. It's some kind of device or, thing that will turn back time or create an alternate dimension or something like that. Something to do with time and a different world, a different place, right? And we know why White Rose wants that for him and his lover. But for Elliot, now we realize that context, another world where his life wasn't shitty. He didn't have a shitty childhood.
Totally.
He did have a loving father, maybe even a loving mother, where this wasn't happening to him and to Darlene too, potentially. So that's very critical information that kind of implies that White Rose is aware. And I'm curious as to how he even understood or came to know that information.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. It feels like he knows more than he really should. And literally we just don't know enough to know how he found all of that out.
There also seems to be, in the more recent episodes between Wang Shu, Mr. Zheng's assistant, and White Rose, that there seems to be more, what's the right word for it? More compassion almost, and more of a soft spot towards Elliot from White Rose, where he doesn't want to kill him off right away. There almost seems to be some empathy involved between the two of them. He understands what he's going through, and he understands what it's like to not want to live in a world that you're living in right now.
I agree with that. I totally agree with that. Yeah, I was going to take a major tangent and say, you've never seen the movie Fight Club, right?
I haven't, but I know the context.
Yeah, so basically, there's this guy who lives a very cookie cutter life, doing everything that he thinks he's supposed to, IKEA furniture, regular job, and just going through the motions without really living. And so he creates this alter ego personality named Tyler Durden, but it's very similar to how Elliot meets Mr. Robot for the first time. He thinks he's a totally different person. And Tyler's everything he wants to be. This basically just this raw version of himself where he's living life to the fullest. And I always thought that's who Mr. Robot was for Elliot.
Yeah, totally.
This kind of really cool alter ego, not afraid to take down the man and kind of go full force at it. But yeah, this was a way darker take on all of that.
Oh yeah.
And so I think so interesting how we were really just not expecting this at all, even though in retrospect it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely. This is more of a technical addition. But Sid had a good find that I want to share on the podcast. So there's a technical term, a coding term, called the Alderson loop, very aptly named, and very well could be, or I think it probably is, purposely done. And Elliot's last name is Alderson, where this technical term of coding is defined as a special version of an infinite loop where there is an exit condition available but inaccessible in the current implementation of the code, which completely and accurately defines what Elliot is going through or has been going through in these last 4 seasons of the show, where he seems to be on some sort of loop that he can't get out of because it's just written in his code to continuously be on this loop. And I think this is the season, or this is the time for him now to break out of that loop once and for all and just face all the repressed fears and emotions that he's been hiding for so long within himself. And like Swetha was saying, face either Edward Alderson or a version of himself that has this new information, or this old information, I should say.
Definitely. He's kind of trapped in a way where he doesn't have all of the information and he's trapped. He's like trying to figure it out. Like, why is Mr. Robot here? Like, what's going on? And then finally, I think he's finally heading towards that exit. Mm-hmm. Once he finally heals, understands everything that happened, understands all of these different versions of himself and all of these different personalities and why they exist and what's their purpose, I think he'll finally be able to exit this loop that he's found himself trapped in.
Absolutely. This obviously was a very dark episode. There's a lot of emotions and things happening, but I just want to stress how well this episode was filmed. Just everything about it was just so well done, and I thoroughly enjoyed it so much. From the ambience to the acting to everybody, it was just so great, and what a high caliber episode. But yeah, so going into the promo was a very quick promo like usual. But now we're shifting towards the evening time on Christmas Day. I don't really know the time frame of this week's episode. I'm assuming it probably happens around the same time that Darlene is captured and being captured, maybe even heading into the late afternoon. But anyways, the promo for next week is definitely during the evening. The first scene is Krista. There's a split second of Krista and Elliot seeing a young version of him, kind of the new Mr. Robot that he's seeing right now in this phase of his journey. And Krista's essentially telling Elliot, like, we got to get out of here after she subsequently stabs Vera, like the heroine that she is. And the scene right after that, I believe, is most likely just outside of Krista's apartment, and the ambulance probably taking Vera out of there. And very quick scenes, all of these. I believe there's a scene of young Mr. Robot or young Elliot running away from something, and it's either just in New York somewhere or it's potentially a flashback memory. I'm not sure. And so after that, I believe it's getting towards Darlene and Dom. They're both obviously caught and being dealt with by Janice, our favorite taxidermist. And she basically says, like, how many people do we have to hurt for you to confide and fess up about where your brother is? And
not just her, she asked like, how many people need to die?
Oh, how many people have to die? Okay, I wasn't sure if it was her or die. Yeah, she's all the way there. Janice, I should know better. Janice is all about the 100. You go all the way.
Yeah, 100.
Keep it 100. Yeah, and the scene right after that is, or some at some point in between. Swetha had mentioned this earlier. There's a quick scene on the subway where they're waiting on the platform for the train or bus or whatever it is, and young Elliot, Mr. Robot, is standing there with him, and it does seem like they're kind of having some time together, and maybe, hopefully, are going to be talking through some of these memories and hopefully helping Elliot process through these memories. The scene after that is, I don't know who, someone that is hooded. 2 hooded men are coming into, looks like somebody's home. I think it's Dom's mom's house, but I'm not for certain. But someone is stabbing a bunch of people. Both these 2 people are stabbing a bunch of people, and there's someone hiding in the corner, just like completely in shock and just terrified out of their mind. I think that's after when Janice says, how many people do I have to kill for you guys to finally, confess and tell me where Elliot is? And eventually Darlene says, okay, fine. And it seems like she's ready to fess up. And I think that's pretty much where it ends. I don't know if I missed anything.
No, to unpack that a little bit, Elliot really seems lost in
Yeah.
the promo for the next episode. Obviously, he's processing this big revelation in his life, and I agree he's seeing visions of this young Elliot. And I just had an interesting thought. You kind of framed it that he's the new Mr. Robot. What if inside Elliot's mind, like this boardroom scene, Mr. Robot's like, okay, like my time is up, and he kind of sends young Elliot out.
Yeah.
Like, okay, now it's your turn to help him and guide him.
I really like that, actually.
Be there for him.
They're kind of in like a rotation.
Yeah, definitely.
Very interesting. I like that a lot.
And I think one thing that we still do not know, and I really, really hope the show gives it to us, is how does Elliot end up where he is at the beginning of the series, where he does not remember Darlene, he is completely alone and really, really broken, but not really invigorated by this idea of bringing down E-Corp. He's kind of there. He calls it Evil Corp. He sees what Angela is going through with her student loans and he wants to help her. And those ideas are budding, but Mr. Robot comes out of nowhere and like shakes up his world. I do think Mr. Robot was present before we see him at the beginning of the series. I think Mr. Robot has been with him for a long time. Elliot straight up asks him during, this therapy session, he's like, how long have you been here? And I think it's been a lot longer than just this past year. But for some reason, Elliot doesn't remember a lot, when we see him at the beginning of the series. I'm so curious to see what happens to Elliot like right before. It's not all of this childhood stuff because a significant amount of time passes. And like we always talk about, he remembered Darlene in the Halloween episode, but then he does not remember Darlene later on. So I still feel like there's a lot more information to explain these missing pieces of the story.
Well, there was a question that I forgot to ask you. So the whole situation in, I think, episode 2, of the season, where we have the big reveal of the third person, where Darlene tells Elliot, like, yeah, like, I was wondering why you were, like, being really chill when Vera came by and, like, asked for you. And we get the whole thing of Elliot confronting Mr. Robot and be like, hey, like, what the heck? Like, why didn't you tell me? You talked to him. He's like, I swear I didn't. So what is that? And now in the context that we have now, what was that? Like, did someone else actually really talk to Vera, or was it actually Mr. Robot?
I don't think it was Mr. Robot, because he looks genuinely like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, and I don't think he's just lying. I do think it was the other person.
But who's the other person? Because so you think it's, in that context then, you believe it's Edward Alderson. There is another complete persona.
Or it's a version of Elliot that took over in that moment.
A version of Elliot, so then that knows about the molestation.
Yes.
So you do feel like there is a version of him that has known and always known before this whole thing.
Possibly. I think it's not confirmed, but I do think that would make sense in terms of this other person, this other version of Elliot that maybe has the whole picture, has the whole story, and has found a way to cope with it. I
definitely think it was Mr. Robot that talked to Vera that night, and I think he was just lying to him because I don't know how.
Why do you say that? Yeah.
I think it's very clear from this episode that Mr. Robot, it will do anything possible to keep Elliot from knowing the truth, just to protect him. And I think he felt, I don't know if he could feel this or predict, obviously this would be predicting the future, but I think he knows Vera is no good, just in general. And it would throw him off task and off course from what he needs. And he doesn't need more shit in his life, in general. And just want to protect him from that. And probably took over and was like, you know what? Elliot does not need to know about this. He's in a place where it's already shitty. Like, Angela just died. Mom died. There's just, like, other things that are happening right now that he needs to focus on and process that first. He doesn't need this whole Vera situation.
I agree, but I also think it's too much of a stretch to know, for Mr. Robot to know that Vera would have brought out this big reveal. I think there's just no way for Mr. Robot to know. And I don't think, even if he was trying to prevent this from happening, I just think that there's no way for him to know.
No, I don't think he would have known. Like you said, there's no way he could have known. I think it was purely just a form of protecting him. But on that same line, back in season 1, where Elliot has like a mini reveal of who Mr. Robot is, that it's not actually his dad is in fact dead, but this is just like a projection of his own persona, and he goes into his CD disc case where he keeps all the discs of like of everybody he's hacked. There's a disc that has no name on it or no song on it, and that's the disc that he sees of his father and all these pictures of him and his father. And Mr. Robot explicitly lets that happen. I think I remember in that scene, Mr. Robot comes up after him or behind him or something. I'm just like, yep, like, or just kind of confirms like, yeah, that's me or something like that. I'm your dad.
Yeah.
Something like that, right?
Yeah.
But why does he let that happen? Like, those are actual pictures. You know, like, those are real things that happen. Those are real moments and memories. Potentially, that's before everything happened. But I feel like that's a little too close for comfort in Mr. Robot's eyes to triggering Elliot's memory.
That's a great pickup, actually. It's a very dangerous move to allow him to flip through memories of his childhood. Absolutely.
Same reason why I think Mr. Robot might have been a little nervous about Darlene coming back into town. Just anything from his childhood. And his sister was a huge, huge vault of just memories that he can just get access to.
Absolutely. I really do think Darlene is a trigger for Elliot.
Absolutely.
I just can't quite explain the connection.
Right.
I think it's a little bit deeper than just he's a reminder of their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Because just like you're pointing out right now, he can look back at the fond memories of his childhood and not get all this stuff triggered. But there's something about Darlene that just shakes everything up for Elliot and makes everything more chaotic. And maybe it's that he just wants to protect her.
Yeah.
And maybe it's like that, hat that he's wearing that brings all this stuff back. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
and
interesting.
I keep going back to the same point for several episodes now. In season 1, one of the episodes, he looks at a picture of his family, just him, his parents and him. But when he looks back at later, towards the end of the season, Darlene is now there in the picture. And so he's actively repressing her for some reason, some part of his mind, whether that's Mr. Robot or another version of him that he projects on himself. Someone in his psyche just does not want him to remember Darlene for fear of triggering that other persona.
Actually, that's really, really interesting. Even in Elliot's personalities, like in season 1, when he's in Times Square and he sees his family, it's Mr. Robot, Magda, and little Elliot. Darlene should be there. Maybe it's just that Darlene, isn't all that helpful. I don't know. Maybe she's just so young at the time that she's not, a helpful personality for Elliot to have around. But you're absolutely right that when he remembers his family, for whatever reason, young Darlene is not in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's something to that, definitely.
That does make me feel like Darlene knows something a little bit more that we don't know. And I wonder, I don't think it's going to happen next episode because obviously Darlene's kept hostage, but I feel like that is going to be something that they talk about. Or will they talk about? Do you think that Elliot will ask Darlene ever?
Oh, I don't know. It's going to be so hard for him to talk about it with anyone else.
But I'm sure those questions are running through his mind. He's the kind of person where he will call his family out for betrayal. We've seen him do it many times with Darlene. Did you know? Well, how could you not tell me? Or this and that other thing. I can see a scenario where he goes off on her for probably knowing and not telling him and keeping information from him in general.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't know how that would go because I personally generally think that at this point in time, Darlene is not aware. Maybe she had some far off distant memory that this might have happened in their household. But again, she's probably so young. She also might have repressed memories of this situation as well. May generally not remember.
Definitely. I personally think that Darlene did not know.
Yeah, agreed.
But yeah, I'm very, very, very curious to see whether Elliot talks to her about it. And how's he going to even bring it up? It's going to be crazy. Yeah.
So just for an immediate next episode, what do we think is going to happen? Are we going to even see the Deus hack tomorrow? Is it even going to happen at this point? What do we think?
I really don't think so because what we know in terms of the timing is that the Deus hack is the Deus meeting is supposed to happen at 9 p.m. Mm-hmm. And I think we're this next episode is going to be from 6 to 8 p.m.
Probably,
or something like that. I mean, Elliot really needs to be in a different place for him to even start to think about what he's going to do at that meeting. And I'm really curious to see, we were talking about it offline, that it doesn't even feel important anymore.
No.
What if he decides to just team up with White Rose and,
Kind of worried about that.
just like what if White Rose really does like bring him and talk to him about everything that's going on, and maybe he convinces him to drop this battle against him, and
Totally.
maybe he convinces him to join sides. It actually probably makes even more sense for the story. I can't really see just Elliot going ahead with it. It seems like, how could his heart possibly still be in it?
Exactly. And it doesn't make sense at this point. Like, Darlene's definitely all tied up. Also, I don't really understand, like, how at this point Darlene will even, like, how does Darlene even know where Elliot is? Because she wiped her phone. Unless, like, she calls him and gets in contact with him.
I agree. There's absolutely no way she could know that he's at Krista's apartment of all places.
Yeah.
There's just no way she could know that, because he got scooped up by Vera and his men and brought there.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, Darlene doesn't know where he is. I don't know how she could possibly be helpful. I don't know how she could give Janice the information she's looking for.
I think the only way is, like, Janice forces Darlene to call her brother, and whatever, she's at gunpoint, the whole save me act situation happens again. But I don't know. Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know how that's going to work out.
That's a good point, too. It must be Dom's family members that they're going after.
Yeah.
And why? Like, she didn't, I guess for punishment's sake, but it's not like she's withholding any information. She clearly has no idea where Elliot is.
Right. And so that was my question for you. I was like, you watched the promo, you saw that house. It did look like Darlene's parents' house, but I wasn't sure. Other people are thinking that...
You mean DDP's parents' house?
Sorry, yes, DDP's parents' house. Other people are thinking that it may be Leon taking some people out. Now that that could very well be the case. Like, it might be a case where in the course of this episode, like you said, Swetha, it will happen from like whatever, like 5 or 6 to 8 p.m. And in those 2 hours, Elliot is processing and realizes either, yes, I do want to go ahead with it, or no, I don't, or, fuck it all. But either way, I do think he's going to enlist Leon's help and use the day's money to fund him. As Leon says, I just am loyal to the paper. And in what context that is, I'm not sure. I think it'll be a case where Darlene doesn't know where Elliot is, so Janice tells Darlene to call her brother and ask her to come get her or save her or something like that. And so Elliot enlists Leon's help or something along that sort. I don't really know if they can all fit that in one episode, but I don't know. I don't know how they're going to get out of this one.
Yeah, definitely. I don't see really a clean way out for DDP and Darlene. Although that is an interesting theory. Maybe Elliot hits Leon up to go to the rescue. But Elliot doesn't know that Darlene's in trouble right now. He has no idea.
Correct. And like I said, the only way he would know is if Darlene calls him. Because she does have her phone. Obviously, Janice has her phone. And I think at this point, the only way that anyone's going to find out where Elliot is by getting in contact with him.
Definitely.
There's one more thing. Oh, yeah. But there is an interesting point at the end where Darlene eventually says, okay, fine, I'll do it, or whatever Janice wants her to do. And I feel like at some point it's something to do with DDP. Maybe Janice finally threatens to kill DDP. Because there's no one that Janice can kill in Darlene's life that would make Darlene's give it up besides killing Elliot. And they don't know where Elliot is.
But Janice does say at the end of 2 episodes ago where she says, you're far too valuable to kill.
Correct. So I think it's going to be a rough situation where slowly Janice is killing every member of DDP's family, and the only person that can stop this from happening is Darlene.
Ugh.
That's the only thing I can see that happens, which is so messed up.
I agree. And Darlene does have a fair amount of guilt about what she's put DDP through. Totally. So I totally think it'll still work. Yeah, but yeah, gruesome.
Gosh. I mean, the season's really, really turning out to be super dark, but so good.
I know. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just so many possibilities in terms of what could happen next. And it's really interesting how the show has left so many reveals for the very last season. Yeah. You think, how could they possibly pull this off? But they're doing an amazing job so far.
Yeah, and it feels like the right timing somehow, too.
Yeah, definitely.
Very well done. I think that's it. Any other last comments or questions?
No.
Yeah, I think we did this justice, talking through everything.
So Sid's in Taiwan, maybe secretly meeting with White Rose, drinking at bars, having ramen, but he'll be back next week.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is it. This is Swetha.
And this is Rainy. Bye, guys.
Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.